Sonia. I appreciate it. And first, before I start, I want to thank Carolina Deliverance Evangelistic Church and Sonia and everyone who's been part of putting this together. And I really also just want to commend you for having this discussion. It's a difficult conversation, and it's a complicated one where, it's hard to know sometimes what to think. And so it's easy to not want to engage with it. So I want to commend you for having that conversation, for being here tonight. So I want to introduce myself, but just to start by saying, that I work with Jews for Jesus, and so I want to tell you a little bit about who that is, because Jews for Jesus, just so you know, we are a Christian ministry made up of Jewish missionaries. Our mission isn't to talk about the era of Israeli conflict or Zionism, or to teach a particular eschatological system of the end times. We are an evangelistic ministry, and so our mission is to bring the gospel to Jewish people, so that Jewish people can be introduced to Jesus, experience, and be transformed by him. So that's really the mission of Jews for Jesus. But we do have a significant work in Israel. A lot of the people I work with are missionaries in Israel. A lot of the missionaries I train are missionaries in Israel. I also have a lot of personal experience in Israel, and just many Jewish people, even if they've never been to Israel, have a connection to Israel. So I just wanted to make that clear. And then Sonia said this, but I only represent myself, and the views that I share are really my views, not necessarily Jews for Jesus views. Jews for Jesus doesn't have a position on the Arab Israeli conflict. We don't even have a position on Zionism, because we make the gospel our focus. And so our staff have a variety of views. And I'll try to give you kind of a lay of the land when it comes to how Jewish believers in Jesus in particular think about this conflict. So I wanted, though, to start with just sharing with you my story. I grew up in a Messianic Jewish home. Jewish Christian, it's another way of saying that. I'm perfectly comfortable saying that. I sometimes will say I'm a Jewish believer in Jesus. But what that basically means is that my mom grew up in a traditional Jewish family. Sonia mentioned that my mom is actually the daughter of a Holocaust survivor who escaped Nazi Germany in 1939. And my dad is from a Christian background, so I'm actually from a mixed marriage. But I was raised with this very strong Jewish identity, and we really valued our Jewish heritage, but really emphasized the way that Jesus is the Messiah. We would often call him Yeshua, but we kind of used it interchangeably with Jesus. Yeshua is just the Hebrew way of saying Jesus. And so we believed in Jesus, even though we celebrated things like Hanukkah and Passover. We had Shabbat dinners, which is the Friday night Sabbath meal that Jewish people celebrate. I had a lot of Jewish, non-Messianic Jewish, so just mainstream, traditional Jewish friends. My mom's relatives, none of them were believers. My mom's the only believer in her family. And so I had a lot of exposure to Judaism and Jewish culture, as well as being brought up in the Messianic community and in the church. So I sort of straddle different worlds. And I think the other important thing to know about my upbringing, which actually probably sets me apart from maybe most other Messianic Jews, just part of my mom's story is, being the daughter of a Holocaust survivor, she had a lot of questions about God and how God could allow that. And really, for Jewish people of that generation, the state of Israel was a big part of the answer. That the kind of the story we still tell ourselves is that out of the ashes of the Holocaust rose this Jewish state in Israel after 2,000 years of suffering and exile and persecution. After the worst tragedy in our history, we returned home. And a lot of Jewish people will even talk about it as kind of the first blossoming of our redemption. And so, my mom really imbibed this story as a young Jewish girl growing up. I'm so sorry about
Oh, there you
that.
go. Hi.
I don't know. I think my computer is just working too hard or something. Sorry about that. But you got me back.
Yeah, glad to have you back. So one of the last things I heard was you were saying how out of the ashes of the Holocaust, we returned home.
Right. So, my mom really imbibed this story, and she was part of a group of Jewish youth, and she was like, I think, 16 years old, traveling in Israel with a bunch of American Jewish kids. And one of the things, being in the land of Israel, the land of our ancestors, was really special for her. But one of the things she noticed was the way that Palestinians were treated. And it really bothered her. And she made the connection that she felt that the Palestinians were not being treated dissimilar from the way that her father and her grandparents and other relatives had been treated. And that really bothered her. And so my mom actually ended up studying in Israel, but studying Palestinian history and studying with Palestinians. And she actually got her doctorate at the University of Chicago studying Middle Eastern history and worked with a lot of the leading Palestinian historians. And so my whole upbringing, I also was exposed to the Palestinian world. And I remember traveling several times to Bethlehem and going to Bethlehem Bible College and hearing the Palestinian perspective. And as a teenager, I spent time in a refugee camp outside of Bethlehem and just kind of saw it and saw what it looks like. And so these were really formative for me, as well as my own Jewish identity, feeling very connected to Israel. And so for me, there's a complexity just in my own experience that I just learned that there has to be space for more than one story. So you're going to hear that kind of in the way that I will talk about my views of the Arab-Israeli conflict. But I do want to talk about, what it means to be a Jewish Christian, a Messianic Jew, because, again, that might be new for many of you. And so to understand how a Jewish Christian would feel about the Arab-Israeli conflict, really first need to understand who the Jewish believers in Jesus, Messianic Jews, who we are. So first of all, going back to the New Testament, there's always been Jewish believers in Jesus because Jesus was Jewish, his disciples were Jewish, the whole movement was Jewish, and the early church was entirely Jewish until some of the Hellenistic Jews, that's the Greek-speaking Jews, the multicultural Jews, people who sort of had to code switch between speaking Greek and speaking Hebrew, they started sharing the gospel in Antioch with Gentiles. And soon after, the Apostle Paul went on his famous missionary journeys, and many Gentiles came to faith in Jesus. And eventually there had to be this famous Jerusalem Council in Acts 15, where the leaders had to decide what to do with all of these Gentiles joining the church. And over time, there were thousands of Jewish people responding to the gospel. If you read the book of Acts, it was not a small number of Jewish people who believed in Jesus. So when you hear people say the Jews rejected Jesus, that's not exactly true if you believe the New Testament. The New Testament says that thousands and thousands of Jewish people were embracing the gospel, as well as thousands and thousands of Gentiles. But over time, there were many more Gentiles than there were Jewish people. And the Apostle Paul really wrestled with this, and you can see him wrestling with this and trying to work through this in the book of Romans, especially chapters 9, 10, and 11, where the Apostle Paul really looks at the unbelief of the majority of the Jewish people, but he also sees that there is a remnant, he calls us, the few that have embraced Jesus, and he sees this as evidence of God's faithfulness, and that one day, not only would a remnant be saved, but he says in Romans chapter 11, verse 26, that all Israel will be saved. And what I think he means by that is that not just a small percentage, a remnant, a minority, but that there would be a national turning of the Jewish people to Jesus. So, these days there's not very many of us. In fact, we are. The exact numbers there's a lot of dispute. I think it's less than 1% of Jewish people around the world believe in Jesus. But, the high number, it's, a couple, like maybe 2, maybe 3% is if you have the very high numbers, which I don't necessarily buy. But regardless, let's say there's 3% of Jewish people in the world believe in Jesus. It's not very many Jewish believers in Jesus. There's not that many Jews, really, in the world. We're about 2% of the American population. And so there's not a lot of Jewish believers in Jesus. And, we talk about how in some ways we're a minority within a minority, and we don't quite fit in wherever we go. And there's a Jewish Christian writer who made the joke that they were too Jewish to be Christian and too Christian to be Jewish. And I don't take that literally. I believe that I'm fully Jewish and fully Christian, but that's the way it often feels for Jewish people who believe in Jesus. That there's not space for us in the Jewish world, certainly. And even in the Christian world, where many people love the Jewish people, support the Jewish people, it's still, there's something that kind of sets us apart, and it can be hard for us. And really, for me, the way that worked out is as a kid, I used to wrestle with my identity and wonder, why am I Jewish and why am I Christian? Why can't I be one or the other? And really, it was my studying the Bible and discovering Jesus and really seeing his Jewishness and seeing that I can't separate my Jewishness from my Christian faith, that really encouraged me to kind of be my whole self, but also then ultimately to be a missionary to my people and to bring the gospel to the Jewish people. As Paul says in the book of Romans, that the gospel is to the Jew first and also to the Gentiles. And I think that's still true. And so that's why I do what I do. So even though the early church was completely Jewish and the leadership was Jewish, for the last 2,000 years, we have been a very small minority. So now I want to transition, though, to talking about the difference between Jewish believers here in the States and Jewish Christians in Israel. And there is a distinction. First of all, Jewish Americans, I've just found, are very, very different from Jewish Israelis. Part of that is that when the Jewish people who started immigrating to Israel did that, they really wanted to reinvent what it meant to be Jewish. They wanted to leave behind the Jewish persona of the sufferer in exile being persecuted. But they wanted to leave that in Europe or the Middle East or wherever they were coming from and build a new, strong, free identity in Israel. And so that really is a very different identity than Jewish people living outside of Israel. But for the believing community, there's a lot that unites us. I think being so few, we need each other, and so we're not going to, separate very easily. So there is a lot that unites us. That a strong Jewish identity, unites us. Caring about our people. I think one of the things we'll talk about is that the Jewish believing community tends to be very Zionist, very supportive of Israel. And that's part of that there's this very strong solidarity. But Israelis tend to see their Jewish identity more in sort of national patriotic terms. That really has to do with living in Israel, speaking Hebrew, serving in the army. That's all really central for them. And, for Jewish people, there's all kinds of debate. Is it adherence to Judaism? Is it Jewish culture? Is it a sense of humor? It depends on who you ask. But, we really live, our identity, the identity we live is really that of minority. right? So Jewish people living in America, we're living in a primarily Gentile country. And so that's really a lot more our identity, is that we are different from the majority. And so the things that make us different kind of become very central. And sort of the boundaries between us and others becomes really central. And that's just not how Israelis think. They don't think that way. As far as the believing community, I think one of the big differences is that Israelis, just in general, are maybe more aligned culturally. I'm not really talking about theology. I'm just talking about culturally with kind of more charismatic evangelical culture. Whereas in the States, Messianic Jewish identity might be more of focus of trying to emphasize our Jewishness. And again, it's connected to what I was talking about earlier, the general difference between American Jews and Israelis. But again, so despite those differences, I think that the commitment to our people and commitment to the country of Israel is really central to our identities. And so, okay, that being said, I want to talk about my view about what it means to kind of be a Jewish believer in Jesus, a Jewish Christian, and think about the Arab-Israeli conflict. Now, I'll try to be brief because I want to leave lots of time for questions. But, so again, I'm representing myself, not representing my movement. I'm not representing my organization. And really, most people are maybe much more kind of supportive of, I don't want to say more supportive of Israel, but tend to be more politically aligned with a certain approach to supporting Israel no matter what Israel does. I'm a little bit different. I identify as a Zionist. I believe in Israel. I love Israel. I've been to Israel many times. I feel very connected to it. But I have reservations about certain aspects of Israel. I have certain criticisms of things Israel does. And I'm not so far, though, out of the mainstream when it comes to the American Jewish community. I think probably I'm much more similar to the mainstream American Jewish community in that we love Israel, but there's things that Israel does that don't reflect our values. And I think that really the biggest thing has to do with the Arab or Palestinian Israeli conflict. And so all that being said, I'm also not comfortable with the normative Palestinian narratives, which basically will see Israel as fundamentally illegitimate, as oppressive. And so, I don't have all the answers for sure, but I see the complexity. And, for me, I think Israel is an important place as a refuge for the Jewish people because of the realities of anti-Semitism, such as my ancestors experienced, and because of the Holocaust kind of showing how far that can extend. I think that a Jewish state is necessary. I think that a Jewish state in Israel is the only place a Jewish state makes sense. But in order for that to happen, the Palestinian people, it really comes at their expense. Because, the truth is, there were people living in the land of Israel, which was before the state of Israel was founded, called Palestine. They lived there for hundreds of years. There's families, Palestinian Christians that I know, who can trace their family lineage very far back. They can show their land deeds, the land that is rightfully theirs. And you're going to hear more of that perspective, so I'm not going to get too much into it. But the way I see Israel is that Israel is a just cause. It's a place that I believe in, that I think should exist. But I have to acknowledge that its existence comes at a cost. And I think that gives Israel a certain responsibility to behave in a certain way and to pursue a just peace with the Palestinian people. I think, again, I don't think Israel needs to leave the land and give it back. But I do think that Israel has a responsibility to pursue peace. And I don't think Israel always does that. And so I don't think that Israel is perfect, but I also don't think that, I think there's also a genuine desire for peace that many Israelis hold. And there's been real efforts and attempts made at peace. And, you can leave it to the experts to talk about why different aspects of it failed. But I'll just say that it's not that one side is pure evil and the other side is pure gold. Pure gold. They're all, it's mixed, and there's very good reason for the Israelis to mistrust the Palestinians and to fear terrorism, to be concerned about their security. But I don't think that absolves Israel of doing the right thing. Now, when it comes to this particular conflict, this is a long conflict, and so it goes back, even before the state of Israel was founded. There's been about 100 years of conflict between the Jewish people and the Palestinian people in this land. But the October 7th terrorist attack massacre, we have to remember, happened when there was a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel. Okay, so there was an agreement that there would not be fighting. There was peace. It was not a permanent peace. It was not a just and sustainable peace. Gaza was suffering terribly, both because Israel has blockaded it, but they blockaded it because Hamas, which is a terrorist organization committed to the violent destruction of Israel, is in charge of Gaza, and it remains in charge of Gaza today. It was an unprovoked attack. It was an attack focused overwhelmingly on civilian populations. It was an attack that targeted women and children as well as men. It used sexual violence. People were tortured. It was really unspeakable things happened. Hostages were taken, and those hostages, we know, have been abused in every imaginable way. And we just have to say that there's nothing that justifies this. No sin of Israel justifies that level of violence and barbarism. And I think, I've said that I believe that Israel's war in Gaza is just, but I see the same things that many people see, that I assume that everyone here has seen. And I see the undeniable immense suffering of the Palestinian people living in Gaza. And I see their pain. I see, their starvation, the famine. And, I don't know that Israel is always doing the right thing. I wish I could say that I had confidence that the Israeli Defense Forces and the Israeli government were operating using just means in what I think is a fundamentally just war. I also don't necessarily trust the media reports that come out of it. Part of that, it's not even that I think that there's nefarious subterfuge or anything. I think that there's the fog of war, and I think it's very hard to look at things objectively. And just looking at recent history, there's reports that come out of Israeli atrocities, and they'll hit the news. Israel did these war crimes, and then a few years later, there's revisions that come out, and they'll show that they were not really well done reports. And so, I don't want to use that to sort of let Israel off the hook in terms of holding them accountable. I think that Israel is a nation. It's a democracy. There's rules and there's a way to conduct war. And if Israel isn't doing that, it should be held to account. But at the same time, Israel is not a terrorist state that we need to police. I think that Israel should be treated the same way we would treat any nation going to war. And it's very hard for me to imagine that any country would respond to the vicious attack and abduction of its citizens in a very different way. I think one of the things that kind of indicates just the evil of Hamas is that their strategy, that what they did, it really doesn't allow for a righteous response. I don't know what Israel could do differently. I don't think that Israel has clean hands in this war, but I don't know how different they could have responded. And so I think it's very complicated. And obviously, this is a momentous day as there's this ceasefire that's been negotiated, and the Israelis are on the verge of accepting it. And, I'm praying that it will mean an end to the war and the delivery of aid to the Palestinians. That will be the freedom for the hostages. But, to be honest with you, I don't know that I'm particularly optimistic that this is the end of the story, and that this is the end of the war, and that this is the end of the hostages. But we need to pray that it is. So for me, what kind of, as a Jewish believer, what gives me guidance? What's kind of the compass that I use to make sense of this? And really, first of all, it has to start with Scripture. And I'm reminded that the God of both the Old and New Testament is a God of grace and a God of love. He's a God that doesn't treat us the way our sins deserve. And when Cain killed Abel, God could have held him accountable, but he put a mark on him in order to protect him, because God loves sinners. And we see that all through the story of the Bible, up till we get to Jesus, who gives us this very, the pinnacle of Christian ethics is Jesus' command that we love our enemies. And that command can only make sense if you understand that when we were enemies, Christ died for us. So we have to remember that, Israel, Hamas, neither side are Christian, right? Israel is a secular Jewish state. There are Messianic Jews living in Israel, and there are Messianic Jews who are serving in the Israeli Defense Forces. I know several who have done tours of duty in Gaza. There are Palestinian Christians. I don't think any of them are fighting for Hamas. I think there are Palestinian Christians in Gaza, not very many. Most of them have had to leave because of Hamas, which has persecuted the church. And so we're talking about two peoples that don't believe in the teaching that we are to love our enemies. And so I think it's an important thing for Christians to keep in mind, but that as we think about how we speak into this conflict, I think that Jesus's guidance of loving the enemies is really the North Star for our ethics. And so we pray for an end to the war. We pray for the Palestinians. We pray for the Israelis. So I want to stop there and give time for questions.
Thank you for that talk, Sam. I really appreciate that. So for the participants, if you can use the Q&A button, which is on the bottom next to the share, to ask your questions. We'll read those out loud. While we wait for that, two things you said stood out to me. And so I have two questions for you. One, Carolina Deliverance is an evangelical church.
Yeah.
So you have lots of evangelicals on the call.
Yes.
From evangelical standpoint, the Jewish desire to be in Israel and the right comes from the Old Testament.
Yeah.
From what I heard you say was the desire for many for the state of Israel came out of the Holocaust.
Yeah.
Do you think those two beliefs can reconcile? Or do you think fundamentally, you have a difference in belief in that evangelicals are rooted to the Old Testament, where you have a lot of people who are actually rooting the desire for the state of Israel to what happened in during World War II?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Sonia. and yeah, this is maybe the hardest thing for Christians in my experience to understand. So, most Jewish people, both in the United States and Israel, and I'm saying most, not all, are secular. They are not particularly religious, but they have very strong Jewish identities. Now, that's hard for a lot of Christians to understand because, if you're a Christian, that means you believe that it's true, and if you don't believe it's true, then you're not a Christian. But actually, um, we understand that religion has cultural dimensions as well, and that's very true for the Jewish people. It's really more of a people with a faith than just a religious system. It's not just a system of theology or belief or ethics even. It's a people, and that people has a relationship with God. And because the people has a relationship with God, the individual relationship with God is not emphasized. So most Jewish people don't believe literally in the Old Testament, and they wouldn't literally point to that as the divine sanction for Israel's existence. They would see the Old Testament as kind of maybe there might be some who would point to it as the historic claim. Okay, not so much divine, but history. Yeah, look, we had a history here. This is a book of history. Some would use it that way. Some would see it as our myth, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it didn't happen at all, but it's much less about what historically happened than the lessons it teaches us. It's our people's story. It's what helps us make sense of the world. And so there's Zionists who would use the Bible in that way, but very few who would use it to sort of say this is, thus saith the Lord, the land belongs to the Jews. Now there is a very influential group that does, and they're called the National Religious Zionists or Religious Zionists. And a lot of them are in the settlements in the West Bank, or what is often known as Judea, Samaria, in different terminologies. And so they're less than 20% of the Israeli population, but they're significant. They're strong. They have a lot of political power at this moment. They're a crucial part of the current government. But they're also a very diverse group of people. They don't all see things the same way.
Thank you for that answer. We have one question in the chat box. It says, now we have another. Thank you. The first one is, can you speak to being Hebrew versus Jewish?
Yes. So the first time that the word Hebrew is used in the Bible is to describe Abraham. And it sort of has this idea of someone who crosses a border. It's someone who's kind of from over there and they've come here. That's what it means. So Abraham was called a Hebrew because he was kind of a foreigner. He was not from here, and it stuck. And so the kind of the Hebrews are that's another name for the Israelites. So Jew actually comes from the tribe of Judah, and that became the preeminent tribe of the southern kingdom because of King David and the messianic promise, right? So in Genesis 49, Jacob blesses his sons, and he says that the scepter is not going to depart from Judah. In other words, the Messiah is going to come from the tribe of Judah. Judah becomes the leader, especially of the southern kingdom. When the northern kingdom gets taken away by Assyria, that's like the 10 lost tribes of Israel. So 10 of the 12 tribes disappear from history. And there's a remnant kind of from those tribes, though, like the refugees went south to Judah, but then eventually Judah also gets carried off into exile. And that's when we stop calling ourselves Israelites or Hebrews, and we start calling ourselves Jews. So they're kind of synonyms in a lot of ways, especially from a Christian point of view. Israelite, Hebrew, Jew, you can kind of use them interchangeably, but those are the different origins.
Thank you for that. The next question is, so speaking for the Jewish majority, if the Old Testament is not divinely inspired, what book would be, I'm trying to understand the question. uses a divinity. So I'm going to give you what I think the essence of the question is.
Yeah.
If the Jewish community doesn't look at the Old Testament as being divinely inspired, is there a book or a thing that they would call divinely inspired in lieu of the Old Testament?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. So I wish I could guess. So the people who don't believe the Old Testament is inspired, they don't believe there's an inspired book. So they're not going to have an alternative to the Old Testament that they would point to as actually inspired. Now, that being said, if you are religious, and therefore if you believe that the Old Testament is inspired, so two things. First of all, Jewish people, they'll say it means something a bit different. So Jewish people believe that God handed Moses the entire Torah at Mount Sinai, and that the Torah as it exists, written now, has existed since before the creation of the world. So they don't believe that Moses wrote it in, with Christians, we talk about there's sort of this inspiration where God inspires the writers, the Spirit leads them, but they're also, they're really writing. Their personalities come through. That really isn't the traditional Jewish view. They really see that it's completely divine. Moses is kind of just the deliverer. He's the one who passes it on. So the other thing is that Jewish people the more you revere the Old Testament as God's word, the less in some ways that you actually study it. You read it in synagogue, but in Hebrew, which most Jewish people don't really understand Hebrew. It's really more of an object of worship than it is a book that you would study for the common average Jew. It's really only the scholars who can study it. So the book that Jewish people read, and it's not that it's more inspired, but it's maybe the word is a little more practical, is the Talmud, which is a massive library of the collections of all of the writings of the kind of the early 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th century rabbis who had all kinds of different discussions about legal theory and legends and all kinds of things. That's what actually, if you're a religious Jew, that's what you spend your time studying, is the Talmud. Not as much the Old Testament. And the Old Testament, really, you neglect most of it other than the first 5 books, which is the Torah. That's really much more what the Jewish people will read.
Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
If I didn't ask that question properly, because I paraphrased it, could you please just re-put it in the chat for the person who asked it? The next question is, how significant is it for most Jewish people to say Judah and Samaria rather than the West Bank? Is there a real movement towards that nomenclature?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So you picked up on that. So if you're a religious Zionist, and again, so that's a very specific group, they're going to overwhelmingly refer to it as Judea and Samaria. And I'd say also the more politically on the right, I'm not really talking about American politics, I'm talking about Israeli politics. The more you're aligned with the right, the more likely you are to use Judea and Samaria. And those are the biblical names of that land. That's how the Bible refers to it. But politically, it really signifies that it's a Jewish land. It's not a Palestinian land. So we're not going to use the term West Bank. So I tend to use West Bank. I'm not even trying to say anything politically. It's just what I'm used to saying. I think most American Jews would probably be very uncomfortable using the term Judea and Samaria, because again, most American Jews are a little more critical and they want a 2-state solution. And so they're not trying to claim that land. They're trying to save that for the Palestinians. But if you don't believe in a 2-state solution, if you think Israel should control the entire promised land, you're more likely to use Judea and Samaria.
Thank you for that. I didn't realize that just saying West Bank was a political statement in some circles. So
it's all political, isn't it?
It seems like it. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Next question. As a Christian, do you feel the Jewish population should leave the land and wait for the Messiah?
No, I don't think that. I think that's, first of all, it's completely impractical. But second of all, So if you will read the Palestinian accounts of what happened, and you'll hear about it, you'll hear about the displacement that happened for the Palestinians. And so, there's, I think, an understandable desire to correct an injustice by saying, well, let's undo it. But the truth is, there's about 6 million, 7 million Jewish people living in Israel. And there is not a place that wants to take those Jews back. The Jews that moved to Israel fled for their lives from, hundreds of thousands fled from the Middle East. Millions fled from Europe. After the Holocaust, some people don't realize this, Jewish people would return home in Poland, for example, and these are people who survived Auschwitz, and the Poles would attack them and even killed some of them. And so, the chant was go to Palestine, is what people said leading up to the Holocaust, after the Holocaust. There isn't a place for them to go. They've also, even if there was, they've been there for generations. Very few of them have memories of being in Europe or in Iran or Iraq or Morocco, wherever they were before. And again, if they go back, there's not a welcome wagon waiting for them.
I think that question's also hinting on there's a certain Jewish population who believes that Jewish people shouldn't return to the Holy Land and to the Messiah. So I think the question's hinting on, from a religious perspective, right? Is that religious view shared between Messianic Jews and that particular, I think it's conservative Jews, but I don't want to get that wrong, but that belief in the Jewish community in some parts.
Yeah, so that's a good point, and you're right. That's probably much more the intent of the question. So there is a teaching. It's more it's the ultra Orthodox, which is not a term they like. They like to use the word Haredim. So these are the Jews you will see with very long black coats, black hats, long beards. Some of them have the teaching that Zionism is a sin because the Jews cannot return to the land of Israel until the Messiah brings them. Really, this has to do with there can't be Jewish sovereignty. Jews can't be free in their own country and without the Messiah. A lot of them live in Israel, though. Some of them live here in New York, but a lot of them live in Israel. And even I've talked to some of these groups who are, they're part of the anti-Zionist groups, and they have family in Israel, and they go to Israel, even though they don't believe that it should exist. It's a very small number of the Jewish community that believes this way. There's also a secular version of that, which is there's anti-Zionists who are a lot of them are part of these anti-Israel protests that are happening. And so I think they would I think their vision is that there would be a democracy for both peoples in the Middle East, not that the Jews would leave, but that there would be it wouldn't be a Jewish state, it would just be a democratic, non-national state.
Thank you. So what I'm hearing is essentially only the Orthodox Jewish people believe that. That's not something that, from a Jewish Christian perspective, that belief's not shared.
I don't think there's any I've never met a Jewish Christian who would say that.
Thank you.
They probably exist, but I just haven't met them.
You can always find one, and then someone will use that.
Exactly.
So, as a missionary, are you often called anti-Semitic for being a Jewish Christian?
Often would be a lot. I don't want to exaggerate. I have been accused of that. And I understand it. From the person who's saying that, the standpoint is that if you believe that Judaism is an invalid religion and that Jews need to become Christians, that's anti-Semitic. Now, obviously, that's a misunderstanding of the gospel, right? The gospel is that God, in his love and kindness, has made a way for people to know him through his son Jesus. It's also, the gospel properly understood for Jewish people is that God's kept his promises to the Jewish people, and he sent the Jewish people the Messiah. And this is what the Jewish people pray for, wait for, hope for. And so it's not anti-Semitic, but again, it's the misunderstanding, which even honestly, some Christians can hold this, that really Christianity is superior. It's a better religion than Judaism or whatever other religion. And so we should convert people so that they can become part of our religion. And really, our motivation should be not superiority, but God's love for all peoples, and realizing that every person should have a relationship with God through Jesus. And it has nothing to do with our own superiority.
All right, so since we're talking about anti-Semitism, as a follow-up question to what you just said, would what you just described be considered anti-Semitic if a Christian believed that Christianity was a superior, I'm trying to quote what you said, religion, and they should convert Jewish people? With that, how about this? Maybe we can broadly define broadly, right? I don't think there's one definition of what is anti-Semitic, what that is, and is that belief, would that be considered anti-Semitic?
So I would say no. If someone, so again, I think it's an error, it's a misunderstanding of Christianity, but I don't think it's anti-Semitic necessarily. It could be. I'll explain that. I think I would say it's more prideful, it's triumphalistic, but it sounds like equal opportunity. Every other religion equally is sort of inferior. It's not necessarily Jews that he's picking on. Now, if there's something specific of like wanting to turn Jews into Christians to get rid of Judaism, that crosses the line to anti-Semitism. But certainly the desire to share the gospel is the opposite of anti-Semitic. In fact, I think it's the greatest act of love is to share the gospel. And so withholding the gospel is actually, ironically, more anti-Semitic.
Thank you. And while we're on anti-Semitism, I made a note. When you were speaking, you said that you can't believe the phrase "the Jews rejected Jesus" because the early church was mostly Jewish, which I thought was a strong statement, and a lot of people would miss that about the Book of Acts in the New Testament. Would you say that phrase is anti-Semitic if someone says like, did Jews kill Jesus?
So great question, and this is kind of a big deal right now. So I would say that for a Jewish person, that it is impossible to hear that is anything but anti-Semitic. Now, that being said, the New Testament has lines that basically say that. But when you understand the context, what they're saying is, and again, the Jew meant something different. It often referred to people living in the region of Judah, as well as Jews dwelling outside of the land of Judah. So it was used differently. I heard it was I think he's a pastor in Charlotte, Kevin DeYoung. I heard him talk about this recently, so I actually recommend. Dr. Kevin DeYoung has a really good article and also a really good. I don't agree with everything he says, but he has a sermon where he addresses this. And what he describes is that when the New Testament says that, it's very clearly contextually referring to the people who were in Jerusalem who participated in what was happening. And so that's what is being referred to. It's not all Jews at all times in all places. And so, I heard a story of a kid growing up getting picked on in school, and kids were calling him a Christ killer. And his response was, "You got to be kidding me. That happened like 2,000 years ago. I'm 8 years old." And so if someone says that 8-year-old killed Jesus, then yes, that's anti-Semitic. But again, I think it's good to slow down because we don't want to accuse the New Testament of being anti-Semitic, God forbid. And I hate to say it, but I've seen well-meaning Christian theologians basically accept that the Gospel of John, for instance, is anti-Semitic, just because the language is it's very difficult, even for me as a Jewish person, to read it and not feel kind of the venom of those words. I don't think that's, though, what John or God were trying to communicate.
Thank you for that. And I also appreciate the history lesson. And earlier you mentioned the word, being Jewish, right? It's referring to the tribe of Judah, which is one of the 12 tribes of Israel. And I like the way you brought the context in that historically speaking, everybody, right, in the region of Judah was considered Jewish. It was to describe the people in the region. Thank you. So the next question is, does the Messianic Jewish people feel any more kinship to Paul's letters to the Hebrews than any of the other of Paul's letters?
That's a really good question. I haven't noticed that. Funny enough, the letter of the Hebrews is honestly, I think it's very Greek. It's written to Hellenistic Jews, and so a lot of its argumentation is actually difficult. It's just as difficult for Jews today as it is for everybody else. It's a beautiful letter. I think that probably we feel a kinship in the fact that it's written to Jewish believers in Jesus, and on that level. But I think Romans probably is more what people will feel a kinship. That's my experience. Maybe I'm projecting that, but growing up, Romans was very big in my circles.
Thanks. I know we have a couple more minutes. What's your belief on the rapture of the church and the part the Jewish people will play during the tribulation period?
Yeah, great. Heavy hitter. I'll just say I have changed my view on this. I was raised in a very dispensational home, and so believed in the pre-tribulation rapture. My parents are really committed to it. But it took a long time for me to move this way. But I think that I now believe that the post-tribulation rapture makes more sense. That the rapture will happen when Jesus returns visibly at the end of the tribulation. I also don't know if the tribulation is literally 7 years or not. I guess we'll find out. And so I'm not a pre-trib rapture guy anymore. Which sets me apart from our old executive director David Brickner, who wrote a book about it called Future Hope, which is a great book. But not everybody at Jews for Jesus, has to agree on this. It's one of the things we give our staff the freedom, and probably I'd say, especially people in my parents' generation, the vast majority of Jewish Messianic Jews would hold to a pre-trib rapture.
Thank you. And the next question brings us back to tonight's topic. Do you feel Palestinian Christians would feel Jewish Christians are doing enough to help with the events happening in the conflict?
Oh, I can tell you, no, they do not think that we're doing enough. And we likewise feel that they're not doing enough. It's with a heavy heart that I say this. Relations between Jewish Christians and Palestinian Christians are as bad as they've ever been after October 7th. And it's been going downhill before that. And, I would just say I think that's one of the places I would ask you to pray, and that the church can really challenge both communities to kind of snap out of it. But, there had been a lot of effort in some circles to have reconciliation between Jewish believers in Jesus and Palestinian Christians. And that was kind of happening when I was younger, when I was a teenager, when I was in my 20s in college. I've experienced a little bit of that, and I saw some of the really beautiful things God was doing. But I think it's dried up. I'll confess to you, I have a few Palestinian friends that I'm still in touch with, and we've been in touch over the past year and a half or so, but it's not been as much as I wanted. It's not easy. I think probably we're both wrong, we're both right. I don't think Jewish believers are doing enough to forge relationships with the Palestinian believers, let alone work for peace. I also don't think that Palestinian Christians are doing enough to stand up to the problems in the Palestinian community. But I don't think we should have to earn each other's right to have friendship and fellowship. We have to accept what people have the capacity to do. And I think, I understand why a Palestinian just doesn't have the space to put up with Jewish believers and our neuroses and our problems. And so we need prayer.
Thank you for that. I will say, not being Jewish or Palestinian, I also think it's important for people outside of the two communities, especially in America, especially the Christian community, especially the evangelical Christian community, which is why I want to do this with an evangelical crowd, to understand the history and to understand the perspectives. Because I feel like a lot of times, evangelical Christians, specifically Christians in general in the US, have a lot of political power that they should exercise. I think every US citizen should. But I think with that power, you need to be armed with the proper knowledge of what's really going on and have that be rooted in fact, so that we can help move forward what we think is right and to help with peace. And so I will say I like that last question that asked about the Palestinian Christians and the Jewish Christians, but I think in general in the states, having knowledge of what's going on, listening to people, give their background and perspective and explaining where they come from, right, will give us the agency to use our political capital to bring about change. So that's all the questions that we have. It's 8:05. Thank you for going over, Sam. I thank you for taking the time out this evening to have a talk with us. Is there a way people can connect with you or reach out or learn more about you that you'd like to share?
I'll put my email in the chat, or maybe you can, Sonia. I don't think I can, but it's the best way is it's sam.rood ROOD at and then jewsforjesus.org. Yep. Yeah, so that's the best way to reach out to me. You can also check out jewsforjesus.org to kind of see what the ministry we're doing. We have a lot of work that we do in Israel. We have a lot of work also in Ukraine. We haven't, a lot of our work's in Ukraine and Israel. And so those are things definitely worth checking out what we're doing. I think whether you support Israel very strongly, whether you're maybe a little more hesitant to support Israel because you have sympathy for the Palestinians, Jews for Jesus, we're evangelistic and we're about getting the gospel out. We're not doing like military stuff. We're not donating to like things that go to like contribute to like the war effort. And so we want Arabs, Jews, Palestinians to hear the gospel and be transformed by it. So